The storm had swallowed everything: the road, the sky, even the sound of her own heartbeat. When Grace Miller heard the knock on her cabin door that night, she thought it was the wind playing tricks again. But when she looked through the frosted glass, she saw him, a man standing in the blizzard, coat torn, eyes hollow, and beside him, a trembling German shepherd with frost clinging to its fur. He said only 7 words. "Please. He's freezing. We just need shelter." What Grace didn't know was that the stranger on her porch wasn't an ordinary drifter. He was a former Navy SEAL whose past was chasing him through the snow. That one choice to open her door would change both of their lives forever. It would test her faith, heal 2 broken hearts, and prove that sometimes the warmest miracles happen in the coldest storms. Before the story begins, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or simply comment amen for all those who still believe that kindness can save a life. The wind screamed through the mountains of western Montana, dragging flurries of snow across the empty 2-lane road. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford F-150, his knuckles white, his jaw set tight beneath a week's worth of stubble. The headlights barely cut through the storm, only revealing walls of white that closed in on him like ghosts. Ethan was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved with lines too deep for his age, the kind that come not from time, but from war. A faded scar ran along his jaw, half hidden by the dark beard he no longer bothered to shave. His eyes were gray, steady, and tired, the eyes of a man who'd seen more than he could ever explain. Beside him, resting its head on his thigh, was Shadow, a German shepherd with black and tan fur now dusted in frost. The dog was 5 years old, muscular and alert even in exhaustion. His right ear had a small notch, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong in Kandahar. Shadow had served with Ethan in the Navy SEALs K-9 division. Since Ethan's discharge 6 months earlier, they'd rarely left each other's side. Shadow's loyalty was the one thing Ethan trusted completely. Ethan's life after the military had been a long stretch of silence. He'd left behind medals, comrades, and a folded flag, one that had covered his best friend's coffin. He never spoke of the last mission, only that it should have been me. Tonight, he was driving to Wyoming to deliver Shadow to a veterans rehabilitation center, a promise made to that fallen friend. But now, the truck's engine sputtered. He cursed softly, guiding the vehicle toward a barely visible turnout. The tires slipped on black ice before the engine gave its final, defeated sigh. The storm howled louder, snow swirling around like shards of glass. "Not now," he muttered. He reached over and patted Shadow's neck. "Guess it's just you and me again, buddy." Shadow's ears perked up. The dog whined softly, then stared through the windshield as if sensing something in the distance. Through the curtain of snow, Ethan saw a faint light, a single, flickering glow, maybe a porch lamp. He grabbed his duffel bag, slung his rifle across his shoulder, habit, not intent, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a hammer. Shadow jumped out beside him, paws sinking into the snow. Together they pushed forward through the blizzard, one careful step at a time. The light grew clearer, a small cabin, half buried in snowdrifts, its chimney coughing weak smoke. Ethan hesitated a moment, the soldier in him instinctively scanning for movement. Then he climbed the creaking steps and knocked twice. Inside, Grace Miller sat by a dying fire, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. She was 31, slender, with ash-blonde hair tied in a loose braid and skin pale from months spent indoors. Her blue eyes had a softness that life had once hardened, the kind of eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. She lived alone at the edge of Bitterroot Ridge, in the cabin she'd inherited from her grandparents. For 2 years, she'd avoided town except for groceries and fuel. Her husband, Luke, had left her for someone younger, taking her savings and breaking her heart in a single winter. Since then, she'd trusted no one, especially not men. The first knock made her jump. The second froze her in place. No one ever came here this late. She reached for the small pistol she kept in the drawer beside the couch and crept toward the door. The wind outside rattled the window panes. "Who's there?" she called, voice tight. A man's voice answered, muffled by the storm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just need shelter for the night, for me and my dog." Grace's pulse quickened. She peeked through the frosted glass and saw a tall figure hunched over something on the porch. A large, shivering animal. Snow clung to both of them, their outlines blurred by the storm. "Please," the man called again. "He's freezing." Grace's finger rested on the trigger guard. Every instinct screamed to keep the door locked. But then the dog lifted its head. Even through the glass, she saw its eyes, deep, intelligent, pleading. She hesitated only a moment before unlatching the door. The wind roared in, whipping her hair across her face. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, holding Shadow close to his side. The dog's fur was soaked, his breath visible in sharp puffs. Grace closed the door behind them, locking it again. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "By the fire," she directed, gesturing with the pistol still in hand. He nodded once and guided Shadow toward the hearth. The dog lay down with a soft groan, curling near the warmth. Steam rose from his coat as the ice melted. Ethan crouched beside him, rubbing him dry with the edge of his jacket. Grace lowered the pistol slightly. "You traveling alone?" Ethan didn't look up. "Just us. Got stuck when the truck gave out." "You picked the wrong night to drive," she muttered, then added, "I don't usually let strangers in." "I don't usually knock," he replied simply. That earned him a small, reluctant glance. His tone wasn't arrogant, just honest. Grace exhaled, still tense but less afraid. She noticed his posture, disciplined, controlled, but his hands trembled slightly from the cold. "You're hurt," she said. He glanced at his shoulder where a dark stain spread across his sleeve. "Old scar. Just reopened a bit." She hesitated, then fetched a towel from the cabinet and tossed it to him. "Dry off before you bleed on the floor." "Appreciate it." The next half hour passed in uneasy silence. The storm battered the walls while the fire crackled softly. Grace made soup from a can and handed him a bowl, then sat on the opposite chair, still watching him. Ethan ate slowly, occasionally sharing a spoonful with Shadow. "He's 5, Ethan said, noticing her gaze on the dog. "Name's Shadow. Served with me overseas." "Overseas?" she asked, curiosity breaking through her guard. He paused. "Afghanistan. Long time ago." She nodded, studying him. The way he moved, alert even while exhausted, the way he scanned the room unconsciously. He wasn't a drifter. He was trained, dangerous maybe, but not threatening. The firelight threw amber shadows on his face, softening the sharp edges. He looked like a man who'd once stood at the center of chaos and now sought peace in its absence. When the wind grew louder, Grace glanced at the window. It's getting worse. Roads will be closed till morning. Ethan nodded. We'll stay out of your way. Just need a dry floor. She hesitated, then looked at Shadow, who had fallen asleep with his head on his paws, tail twitching in dreams. Something in that sight, the quiet loyalty of the animal, melted the last of her resistance. There's a blanket in the corner, she said softly. You can stay by the fire. Ethan met her eyes. Thank you, ma'am. She gave a small nod and turned away, hiding the flush in her cheeks. For the first time in years, another voice, deep and steady, filled the cabin. As the storm raged outside, Grace sat by the window, watching snow pile higher along the porch. Behind her, Shadow sighed in his sleep. Ethan stared into the flames, lost in thoughts of a comrade buried in a desert half a world away. Two strangers and a dog, each with ghosts of their own, sharing warmth against the storm. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit, but inside the small cabin, something fragile had begun to thaw. The storm did not let up through the night. It howled and pressed against the old cabin like a living thing, determined to find its way inside. The small house creaked and groaned, but the fire Ethan had built held steady, throwing a warm orange glow across the wooden walls. Grace sat on the far end of the couch, arms crossed, watching the stranger and his dog with quiet suspicion. The firelight revealed more of him than she wanted to admit noticing. Broad shoulders under a worn flannel shirt, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that looked both watchful and weary. He was the kind of man who moved carefully, as if every sound and motion might mean something. Ethan crouched beside the fire, turning a log with a small iron poker. That should hold for a while, he murmured. Grace said nothing, just nodded slightly. Her hands still trembled from the cold, or maybe from having someone else in her home for the first time in years. Shadow, stretched out near the fire, lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice. The dog's fur gleamed under the flickering light, thick and strong, with a dark saddle across his back. His intelligent brown eyes watched Ethan's every movement. He's well trained, Grace said finally, her tone measured but softer. Ethan looked up. Yeah, he's smarter than most people I've met. A faint smile touched his lips. Grace almost smiled back, but stopped herself. She got up, moved to the small kitchen nook, and pulled out a dented pot from a cupboard. You hungry? Always, Ethan said, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He winced slightly at the movement. Grace noticed. You're hurt. It's nothing, he said, rolling his shoulder as if to prove it. But when he reached to lift a kettle, she saw it. The way he favored his right arm, the faint red stain where his shirt stuck to the skin. Without asking, she took the kettle from him. Sit down, she ordered, her voice firm in the way of someone used to fixing things alone. Ethan didn't argue. He lowered himself into the chair, watching her heat water on the small propane stove. The air between them was filled with the crackle of the fire and the low whistle of wind squeezing through the cracks. When she returned with a bowl of soup, the smell of chicken and herbs filled the cabin. It's instant, she said, almost apologetically. He smiled faintly. I've eaten worse. MREs don't come with time. Army food? She asked, handing him a spoon. He nodded. Something like that. Then, after a pause, I worked in the military years ago. Still do? Not anymore. Grace didn't press. She could tell by the tone in his voice that the subject carried weight, the kind that sat heavy in the chest. As he ate, she wrapped a towel around her hand and moved closer to inspect his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, an old scar reopened by strain. She cleaned it with quiet efficiency, her touch firm but careful. "Looks worse than it is," he muttered. "That's what men always say right before they pass out," she replied dryly. He gave a soft chuckle, one that seemed to surprise even himself. It was a warm sound, foreign to the cabin that had grown used to silence. Shadow raised his head, sensing the change in his master's mood, and wagged his tail lazily. Grace's eyes softened at the sight. "You named him Shadow?" she asked. "Yeah. He used to follow me everywhere, even in the dark. Guess the name stuck." Grace ran a hand over the dog's head. His fur was coarse but warm, and he leaned into her palm like he hadn't felt kindness in a while. "Most dogs like him end up in kennels after service," Ethan said quietly. "But he's not built for cages." Grace looked at Ethan, realizing he wasn't just talking about the dog. The hours passed slowly, filled with the rhythm of the fire and the storm outside. Ethan cleaned his rifle out of habit. Grace watched the precision in his movements, the silent ritual of a man who'd lived by discipline. She thought of Luke, her ex-husband, all charm and recklessness, and wondered how two men could be so different. When midnight came, she wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch, trying to stay awake. But the warmth and exhaustion finally claimed her. Through half-dreams, she heard Ethan's low voice, calm, steady. "We made it, buddy. She's safe too." It was barely above a whisper, but something in his tone reached through the haze of her sleep. Sincerity, gratitude, a kind of reverence. By morning, the storm had dulled to a steady snowfall. Pale light filtered through the frosted windows. Grace woke to the smell of wood smoke and something else. Coffee. Ethan was by the fire, his sleeves rolled up, tending to the chimney. His forearms were scarred but strong, and soot smudged his jaw. He looked entirely at home fixing something that wasn't his. "You don't have to do that," she said, rubbing her eyes. He glanced over his shoulder. It was smoking bad. Flues half clogged. "You got a screwdriver?" She blinked, still half asleep, then fetched one from a drawer. Watching him work, she felt a strange calm. There was no hurry in his movements, just quiet focus. Outside, the snow piled thickly against the windows, but inside, the cabin felt alive. When he finished, Ethan set down the tools and stood back. "That should help your draft. Also fix the hinge on your back door. It was hanging by one screw. You didn't have to." "I like fixing things," he said simply. "Makes the world feel less broken." Grace didn't know what to say to that. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed him one. Their fingers brushed for a brief second, enough to make her heart skip. Shadow trotted over to her, tail wagging. He dropped a piece of firewood at her feet, proud as if he'd hunted it himself. Grace laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. "Is he always this helpful?" "Only when there's food involved," Ethan said with a grin. The moment lingered, quiet and warm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the blizzard's rage had passed. Inside that small cabin, something gentler took its place. Not love, not yet, but understanding. Grace knelt to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into her, content. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of loneliness ease, just a little. She looked up at Ethan, standing by the window, watching the pale morning light. His silhouette against the snow looked steady, like a man who'd seen enough storms to know when one was truly over. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The fire crackled softly between them, saying what words couldn't. The storm had calmed by late afternoon, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. Snow hung heavy on the pine branches outside the cabin, and the air had that eerie stillness that follows chaos. Grace stood by the small window, her fingers tracing the frosted glass, watching as the wind finally began to rest. Inside, the fire crackled low. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, checking the dog's paw pads for frostbite. Shadow looked up at him, tail thumping lazily, then rested his muzzle on Ethan's boot. "You'll be all right, boy," Ethan murmured. "Couple more days and we'll be back on the road." Grace turned toward the small battery radio on the table, twisting the knob until static gave way to a faint voice. Most stations were still down, but one mountain frequency came through, KBRM, Missoula Emergency Channel. "Rescue teams report no major casualties in the Bitterroot region," the announcer said. "Authorities are still searching for a missing veteran, Ethan Cole, 38, former Navy SEAL, last seen driving a gray Ford truck with military tags. He was accompanied by a trained K9 shepherd named Shadow." The words hit her like a spark in dry wood. Grace's breath caught. She looked toward Ethan, who was now pouring water into Shadow's bowl, his expression unreadable. Ethan Cole. SEAL. The man sitting in her cabin was the same one they were searching for. She hesitated, fighting the instinct to confront him immediately. Instead, she moved quietly to the coat rack where his duffel bag rested. The zipper was half open. Inside, beneath folded clothes, she found a black leather wallet and a small metal badge. The identification card read, "Cole, Ethan J., SEAL Team 3, U.S. Navy." Her pulse quickened. So he had lied. When she looked up, she saw him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, expression calm but alert. "You went through my bag," he said, his voice low but steady. Grace froze. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," he said evenly. "I just didn't tell you everything." She held up the card. "You said you used to work in the military. You didn't say you were the man they're looking for on the radio." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Because that report makes it sound worse than it is. I wasn't lost, just stuck." He took a step closer, hands open in a gesture of calm. "I'm not running from anything, Grace." "Then why hide who you are?" He hesitated. The firelight flickered against his face, catching the exhaustion in his eyes. "Because when people hear SEAL, they stop seeing a person. They see a headline or a ghost. I didn't want that between us." Her voice softened slightly. "Between us?" He looked at her then, really looked. And for the first time she saw the man beneath the soldier. "You let me in when no one else would have. I didn't want pity to be the reason." The tension in the room eased a fraction, though her heartbeat still raced. She placed the ID card on the table. "You should have trusted me enough to tell the truth." Ethan gave a quiet nod. "You're right." Before she could respond, Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He stood and faced the door, muscles tight. Ethan reacted instantly, moving toward the window. Someone's out there. Grace grabbed her coat. "Probably just the wind." Shadow barked once, sharp and warning. Ethan raised a hand. "Stay here." He stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching in the snow. The cold bit through the layers of his clothes. Visibility was low, but he could make out faint tracks leading from the tree line. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm but calm. A figure emerged from the shadows near the woodpile. Tall, broad, wearing a heavy green parka. His face was red from the cold, stubble rough on his jaw. "Evening, Grace," the man drawled, ignoring Ethan. "Didn't know you had company." Grace stepped into the doorway, her hand gripping the frame. "What are you doing here, Rick?" The man smirked. "Just checking you're safe. Storm hit hard last night." Ethan studied him. Rick Donovan, about 40, the kind of man who carried arrogance like a badge. His eyes were too familiar with Grace's face, his stance too casual for a friendly visit. "Appreciate the concern," Ethan said, his tone polite but edged. "We're fine." Rick's gaze flicked to Ethan, then to Shadow, who was standing beside his master, hackles raised. "Didn't realize you were entertaining strays." Ethan didn't rise to it. "You've made sure she's safe. You can head home now." Rick chuckled, taking a slow step forward. "You don't tell me what to do, soldier boy." Grace's voice trembled slightly, though she tried to sound firm. "Rick, please leave." Rick's smile faded. He glanced at her, then back to Ethan. "You don't belong here," he muttered. "This is my valley." Ethan took a small step forward, positioning himself between Grace and Rick. His voice dropped low, quiet but commanding. "Then you know what happens when you trespass on someone else's land." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of ice-laden trees. Then Rick spat into the snow. "You watch yourself." He turned and trudged back toward the woods. Shadow stayed tense until the man's silhouette vanished into the pines. Grace let out a shaky breath. "He's been around before. He used to live half a mile away. Comes by sometimes, uninvited." Ethan nodded slowly. "He won't come back tonight." Inside, Grace sank into a chair, rubbing her hands together. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Ethan poured her a glass of water. "Don't apologize. You don't owe him anything. Or me, for that matter." Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of two people shaped by wounds the world couldn't see. Shadow, sensing the shift, padded over to Grace and laid his head in her lap. She stroked his fur absently, smiling through her nerves. "He trusts you," she said. Ethan looked at her with quiet sincerity. "He trusts good people. Doesn't make mistakes about that." The wind picked up again outside, brushing snow from the roof like dust from old memories. Grace watched Ethan sit back beside the fire, his posture relaxed now. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the man in her cabin. She was afraid of what he might mean to her if he stayed. By the third morning, the storm was only a memory, its fury replaced by a strange, solemn stillness. The sky above the Bitterroot Mountains had cleared, revealing streaks of pale gold that stretched over the white expanse. The cabin, half buried in snowdrifts, seemed to sit between two worlds, the chaos they had survived, and the quiet they both feared to return to. Ethan stood by the window, watching the road disappear into the pines. His duffel bag was packed, boots laced, jacket zipped. Shadow sat beside him, ears perked, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The German shepherd was alert but calm, tail swaying in slow, deliberate arcs, as if reluctant to leave. Behind them, Grace poured the last of the coffee into two mismatched mugs. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't know how. Instead, she set one mug on the table and leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge. "So the roads are open again?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, county crews came through early this morning. It's time." Her chest tightened at the word time. He said it like a man used to leaving things behind. Bases, missions, people. "You sure you can make it down the pass?" "I've driven through worse," he said with a small, lopsided smile. Then, glancing at Shadow, he added, "Right, buddy?" Shadow gave a soft bark in response, as if agreeing. Grace smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat felt locked. She'd gotten used to the sound of another pair of boots on her porch, the steady breathing of a dog by the fire, the calm presence of a man who never raised his voice. And now, like the storm, they were about to vanish into the cold. Ethan slung the duffel over his shoulder. "You've been kind, Grace, more than you know. You don't owe me anything." He paused at the door, snowlight spilling around him. "That's the thing," he said softly. "Kindness doesn't owe. It just is." She didn't answer. He crouched beside Shadow, rubbing the dog's neck. "Time to go home, pal." His tone was gentle but firm, a soldier's command softened by affection. Shadow looked back at Grace, tail lowering, and whimpered once before following Ethan out the door. The sound of their footsteps faded into the snow, leaving only the steady creak of the windmill behind the cabin. When Grace finally stepped outside, the horizon had swallowed them whole. On the table near the fire, she found a folded piece of paper weighted down by an empty coffee mug. The handwriting was neat, strong, unmistakably his. "You opened the door when the world had closed on me. I won't forget." Grace read it twice before sitting down, the letter trembling in her hands. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something she hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Weeks passed. The snow melted from the pines, trickling into small streams that wound their way through the valley. Grace returned to her routines, mending fences, walking into town for supplies, losing herself in the small, quiet work that filled her days. But something was different. When she looked at the door, she didn't just see wood and hinges anymore. She saw a night when fear had given way to compassion. One March morning, as she sorted through the week's mail, she found a thick envelope stamped with an unfamiliar logo, the Valor Foundation. The paper was heavy, the seal embossed in silver. Her first thought was that it had been sent by mistake. She slid it open with the edge of a kitchen knife. Inside was a letter printed on cream paper. "Dear Ms. Grace Miller, we are honored to invite you to participate in our new outreach program for veterans and K-9 rehabilitation, focusing on trauma recovery and reintegration. Your name was personally recommended by one of our directors, Mr. Ethan Cole. We believe your empathy and resilience make you uniquely suited for this position. Please contact our Missoula office to arrange an introductory meeting. Sincerely, the Valor Foundation." Grace's hand froze at his name. The ink blurred slightly where her thumb pressed against it. For a long moment, she simply stared at the words, heart thudding. She looked out the window, at the hills where the snow was melting. The air smelled like thawing pine and new beginnings. The next day, she made the drive into Missoula, a 2-hour journey that felt like crossing into another life. Her old truck rattled over half-melted roads, passing small towns and empty fields. The city rose out of the valley like a promise. glass, brick, and movement after months of stillness. The Valor Foundation's office occupied the top floor of a refurbished train depot. Inside, the space was warm and modern, polished wood floors, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Behind the reception desk stood a young woman in a navy blue blazer, her smile practiced but kind. "Welcome to the Valor Foundation," she said. "You must be Ms. Miller. Mr. Cole is expecting you." Grace's breath caught. "He's here." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. When she stepped into the large corner office, the sight stopped her in place. Ethan stood near the window, looking out over the snowy peaks. He wore a gray vest over a crisp white shirt, the first time she'd seen him without flannel or fatigue. His hair was trimmed short, his face clean-shaven, though the same quiet gravity lingered in his eyes. When he turned and saw her, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Grace." Her name and his voice still sounded like warmth in winter. "Ethan," she said, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Before she could speak again, a familiar blur of fur bounded from under the desk. Shadow. The shepherd barked once, tail wagging furiously, as he rushed to her side. Grace dropped to her knees, laughing as the dog nuzzled against her coat. "He remembers you," Ethan said softly. Grace looked up at him, still kneeling, her eyes bright. "I never forgot him." He leaned against the desk, arms folded loosely. "We started this program 3 weeks ago. Thought maybe you'd want to be part of it." She rose slowly, heart pounding. "You recommended me?" "I did," he said simply. "You've seen what kindness can do. That's all this foundation is about. Opening doors that people thought were shut for good." Grace looked around the office, then back at him. The man before her wasn't the stranger from a snowstorm anymore. He was steadier, lighter somehow, like the mountains after the ice had melted. "Why me, Ethan?" she asked softly. He smiled, eyes glinting with that familiar steadiness. "Because you opened the first one." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Shadow sat between them, tail brushing the floor. The sunlight through the window caught the silver badge on Ethan's desk, a symbol not of rank anymore, but of purpose. Grace finally exhaled, the weight she'd carried for years loosening. "Then let's get to work," she said. Outside, the last patches of snow melted under the spring sun. A full year had passed since the storm that had brought a broken soldier, a loyal dog, and a cautious woman together in a snowbound cabin. The Open Paws initiative had grown from a fragile idea into something tangible and good. A program that helped veterans and their retired service dogs find purpose again. It started in a small office in Missoula, but now stretched across several towns in Montana, where mountains met sky and healing came in quiet ways. Ethan Cole had changed in that time, though not in ways anyone could measure in medals or money. His hair was shorter, peppered now with silver near the temples. The beard remained, trimmed and neat, giving him a rugged dignity that made strangers instinctively trust him. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had once seen too much, held peace now, the kind that comes from doing something that matters. Still, sometimes, when the nights got too still, he'd catch himself listening for the sound of helicopters that weren't there. Grace Miller, now 32, no longer hid behind her cabin walls. She worked full-time with Ethan at the center, her natural gentleness turning out to be her greatest strength. She'd grown stronger, her blonde hair often tied back in a loose braid, her hands calloused from training dogs and building fences. There was color in her cheeks again, and laughter that came easily, surprising even her. And of course, there was Shadow, the German shepherd who had once bridged the space between two wounded souls. His muzzle had started to gray, but his spirit was unchanged. He was the heart of the program, the symbol of loyalty that never fades. Every veteran who came through the center met Shadow first. If the dog liked you, Ethan would say, "You're part of the family." The morning of the new facility's grand opening was crisp and bright. Snow glittered on the surrounding peaks like powdered glass. Volunteers moved back and forth across the courtyard, hanging banners that read, "Open Paws Initiative, where second chances begin." The smell of hot coffee and pine filled the air. Grace checked the reception tables, arranging small, handcrafted name cards. Beside her was a woman in her 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with a brisk but kind demeanor. Martha Lang, the head of the Foundation's outreach department. Martha's short auburn hair framed a face lined with warmth and determination. She'd lost her husband, a Marine 20 years earlier, and had dedicated her life since to helping other veterans find their footing. "You sure you're ready for this crowd?" Martha teased, adjusting her clipboard. Grace smiled nervously. "I'm used to small-town potlucks, not press events." "You'll be fine," Martha said, patting her shoulder. "People respond to truth, not speeches." Across the courtyard, Ethan was talking to a group of men in suits, donors, politicians, the kind of people who liked shaking hands but rarely understood what real service meant. Yet Ethan handled them with the same calm professionalism that had once kept him alive under fire. He shook hands firmly, listened more than he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried quiet conviction. When he saw Grace, something softened in his face. He excused himself and crossed the snowy yard toward her. "Everything looks perfect," he said. "You always say that." "Because you make it true." She rolled her eyes, but the blush that touched her cheeks betrayed her. Martha smirked from behind her clipboard. "You two should really just get married already. The staff's been taking bets." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Who's winning?" "Me, if it happens today." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "Don't encourage him." But when Ethan looked at her, there was a glint in his eyes she couldn't quite place. A steady, certain light, like someone carrying a secret worth keeping. The ceremony began just before noon. Guests gathered under the wide wooden arch at the center of the courtyard, where a new bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight. For those who served, and for those who helped them find their way home. Ethan stood on the small stage, microphone in hand, Shadow sitting obediently at his feet. "A year ago," he began, "this wasn't an idea. It was a night in the middle of a blizzard. I didn't know what home meant anymore. I only knew a door opened when everything else had shut. That door led me here." He paused, his gaze finding Grace in the crowd. "To all of you who've ever been in that storm, literal or otherwise, I hope you know this. Someone will open the door, and when they do, walk through it." Applause rippled through the audience. Grace wiped her eyes discreetly. Shadow barked once, as if on cue, and the crowd laughed. When the speeches ended, everyone gathered near the fire pit for coffee and conversation. Snow began to fall, soft flakes, barely visible, like the sky was remembering something tender. Grace stood by the railing, looking out at the mountains. The air was cold enough to sting, but it felt alive. Ethan came up beside her, holding 2 cups of cocoa. "Déjà vu," he said, offering one to her. She smiled. "Except, this time, no storm. Maybe not outside, he said quietly, but I'm still nervous. She turned to face him, puzzled. Why? He set down his cup and reached into his coat pocket. The crowd behind them buzzed with laughter and chatter, unaware of what was unfolding at the edge of the deck. When he dropped to one knee, the world seemed to go still. Grace froze. Ethan. He held out a simple silver ring, polished but unadorned, the kind made to be worn by hands that work. Inside, engraved in tiny letters, were 6 words. Thank you for opening the door. I used to believe some things couldn't be fixed, he said softly, that what was lost in war stayed lost. But you, his voice caught, then steadied. You reminded me that strength isn't just surviving, it's choosing to love again. Grace's eyes brimmed. Ethan, Before she could finish, Shadow barked sharply, tail wagging, as if impatient for her answer. Laughter rippled through the nearby guests who'd started to notice the scene. Grace knelt down too, cupping the dog's face, her other hand trembling as she took Ethan's. You never really left that night, did you? He smiled. Didn't want to. Snowflakes landed softly in her hair. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Then let's keep the door open. The courtyard erupted in applause. Martha cheered louder than anyone, wiping her eyes. Shadow barked again, spinning in a small circle of joy, his paw prints marking the snow like exclamation points. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. Looks better there than in my pocket. Grace laughed through her tears. You practiced that line, didn't you? 3 months, he admitted. They stood, hand in hand, as the snow continued to fall. Light, endless, like a memory refusing to fade. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, mingling with the soft hum of voices and the steady beat of Shadow's tail against the ground. For a long moment, time seemed to fold, past and present meeting quietly under the Montana sky. Ethan looked at the cabin on the hill where it had all begun, now visible beyond the tree line, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Funny, he said under his breath. Feels like we never really closed that door. Grace followed his gaze, her smile turning wistful. Maybe we weren't supposed to. The snow thickened, the air shimmering with a kind of golden haze as the sun dipped behind the ridge. In the soft hush that followed, Shadow trotted toward the path leading up the hill. He stopped halfway, turned back, and barked once, as if calling them to follow. Ethan and Grace exchanged a glance, both smiling. He squeezed her hand gently. One more walk? She nodded. Always. They began to climb, footprints side by side, fading slowly into the white. The last thing visible before the curtain of snow drew closed was the cabin's front door, still slightly ajar, its warm light spilling softly into the winter dusk.